having read your previous work and knowing that you're tackling this topic, particularly uncertainty, I just knew we had to get you on the podcast. So one of the things that really struck me when I knew you were tackling this area was that in many ways it almost seemed like a bit of a contradiction in terms of what had gone before. So I know that in your prior work, you've really been helping individuals, businesses, organizations create models that help create certainty. But here, you almost seem to be like leaning into uncertainty. Is that a contradiction? And if it is, how did you get on this journey?
Well, that's a really good question. And thank you for opening with that. Nothing quite like easing me into the dialogue with some small talk. So
Yeah, sorry about that.
yeah, it's a really good, it's a really good question, and I'm glad you've mentioned it. So yeah, if we rewind the clock, I mean, the three books, each of them, I suppose, cap a developmental milestone in my own journey or trajectory. So if we go back to childhood, I was heavily influenced by my dad, who was an engineer and designer. One time I asked him because he designs pro audio equipment. I asked, like, how do you design loudspeakers? And he says, well, you start with knowing how the ears work.
Mm-hmm.
His solution as an electrical engineer, as an acoustician, and those kinds of things is like, you need to understand the base principles of the things you're working on. And I think that's true. So my first area of real study when I got into kind of thinking about design was, well, what are the psychological principles that can help you have a higher hit rate when it comes to designing products or services or customer experiences? Can you try and be more intentional about ease of use, and those kinds of things? And so that was capped by my first book, The 10 Principles Behind Great Customer Experiences, which did pretty much what it says on the tin. And I'm really glad with how it's held up. Unbelievably, it's kind of gone in the blink of an eye, but it's 10 years old this year. So
Wow.
Principles was where I started. But what happened when that book came out was that people started hiring me thinking I was some kind of consultant or strategist or guru, which couldn't have been further from the truth. I was a designer. I made stuff. I was sketching wireframes in my cubicle when that book came out. And people would call up saying, well, we want to do this customer experience program. We want to do this project. We need to improve the customer experience. And it became very clear to me fairly early on that people were just saying that, and they didn't really have an idea of whether that was the problem or not. Like, everybody was just working in their own little area of the business and working on kind of trying to optimize that locally without any real broader appreciation for the whole. And at the same time as that was going on, I'd had this kind of knee surgery, arthroscopy on both my knees that hadn't helped kind of heal me. And it was only when I found this therapist who started like looking at the body as a whole, and she always said to me, with body pain, the victim screams, not the perpetrator. Like, typically the problem is somewhere else. And I discovered that the problem with my knees was being caused by these muscle imbalances in my glutes and hips and stuff. I started to think, well, here's a major problem that we have, is that we don't think of the business as a system. We're not systems thinkers, in an organization where there's division of labor and specialism. And that's like not only the cause of a lot of stupid catastrophes where people fix one thing and massively break something else. It also compromises your ability to succeed because you're not really working on the, force multipliers, for want of a better term, that can really have the biggest impact. Like, there's no point in improving your customer experience if nobody knows you exist. For example, like, you need to get more people in, or if you've got a great product and nobody's heard of it, stop improving the product and start directing those. I mean, it all makes perfect sense when you think about it. So the grid was really born of this desire to help people try and think in systems more, which is massively valuable. So how did I end up writing about uncertainty? Well, it came about because, with the help of my co-author, who was a friend before he was a colleague and partner, is a very successful entrepreneur and investor. And one of the things that became apparent to me when looking at the grid was that there's 27 individual factors that are listed within these kind of 9 areas, and you don't really control many of them. That's the problem. You don't control many of them. You don't control what your rivals do. You don't control, at least in theory, what the regulators do. You can set your price, but you can't force your customers to pay it. Even if you look at the inflation we've seen recently, nobody's really in control of their costs. I mean, you can cut costs, but you're not really. If you've got to pay market rate for something, you've got to pay market rate for it. Like customers can easily think that your product is too innovative or not innovative enough. So part A was realizing like, oh wow, we don't have a lot of control over these things. But also it came up in my research on systems and systems thinking and my study in that area that the whole typically doesn't behave as the sum of the parts. When you're dealing with a business where there's a lot of dense interconnections and a lot of events that can affect your success, those events are often changing unpredictably. Right. So you've got a lot of things that are out of your control, and you've got a lot of things that are changing unpredictably. And this really taught me a hard lesson pretty late on in the game that was also being mirrored by my experience entrepreneurially, having moved to a foreign country and tried to launch a business from scratch, having moved to America, that, this El Dorado kind of quest that we're on for certainty, for the master strategy, for or this underlying belief that if we just have enough data, or if we just are clever enough, or if we just are analytical enough, then we can expunge that element of risk or certainty. It's just never going to happen, and we need to start embracing that uncertainty, and we need to let go of that delusion. And it's difficult because you've got, well, I mean, first of all, you've got consultants and academics who, don't really like that message because, let's face it, the concepts that succeed in business aren't the ones that work the best. They're the ones that can be packaged and sold at scale. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that your own brain doesn't like it, right? Like your brain has biases that are screening out the randomness and uncertainty of the world, right? Like we habitually kind of confuse hindsight with foresight. We habitually find meaning in things where there is no meaning. Like we post rationalize a lot of what goes on. We prefer to think of ourselves as being in control. And so events are kind of conspiring against us, but we can, because this is exactly what successful entrepreneurs and investors and leaders do, we can develop an alternative approach to business decision making where we accept uncertainty as a fact of life and we twist it to our advantage, and we treat business as more of a numbers game, and we think more probabilistically. And a lot of the things that we think of as being aberrations and sideshows, like, oh, that was serendipitous, we realize they're not sideshows. They're the main event, and they can be kind of, I guess, manipulated, for want of a better word. We can set out to operate in a way that increases the likelihood of serendipitous events and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't say that the concepts from Mastering Uncertainty contradict the 10 principles lessons, or the lessons of principles, or the lessons of systems thinking. Principles work great within a narrow domain. Systems work great when you're looking to optimize a whole. But uncertainty was like the missing piece of the puzzle for me. They're like the kind of Deathly Hallows of business thinking, I guess: principles, systems, and probabilities. And what I found is instead that coming to terms with uncertainty and recognizing the kind of hegemony of chance, or however you want to look at it, actually unlocked the full potential of those other ways of thinking.
Yeah,
in a
it's
very
really
pragmatic and powerful way.
yeah, it's really interesting. So, my background's in mathematics and statistics, so everything you're saying makes a huge degree of sense to me. And as I think about it, I'm almost thinking about physics, actually. It's funny with you talking about the conversations that you had with your dad and how that stuck with you, because when you think about it, if you want a complete picture of the universe, then if then a complete picture of the universe, right? As we know it right now, comes from a combination of um, simple descriptions of how things work, combined with a highly probabilistic view of how things work at a different level. And actually, it's really a it's really a combination of those two elements, fundamental laws, if you like, which appear to hold no matter what the circumstances are, and then also deeply probabilistic thinking that happens in the realm of quantum theory. So to me, I'm like, as I'm thinking about this, it's almost like there might be something more fundamental. There might be a more fundamental truth to what you're saying, even than the realm of business. But anyway, that's probably an aside. It's just something that instantly occurs to me as you're kind of describing these, if you like, patterns that sit alongside each other. I'd love to go
Yeah, well,
into. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that part of the problem is, and my friend Rory Sutherland, who wrote a wonderful book that kind of went into some of this called Alchemy, he points out that in business, unlike in kind of science, I guess for want of a better term, the
Hmm.
opposite of a good idea can be an even better idea. And for
Yeah.
every kind of precept in business that's established, there's someone who's succeeded by doing the opposite. Pretty
Hmm.
much. Even with things like profitability, like we think, well, a business must be profitable. Well, Travis Kalanick became a billionaire running a business that lost more money than any startup in history. So
Yeah.
even principles like that don't necessarily hold true, depending on what your kind of objective is. But I think that we generally don't feel too comfortable with that as a concept because we like. I have, people always tell me that we like certainty and we crave certainty and this, that, and the other. But I have found, and this is straying a little bit more into the philosophical domain, and I don't want to get too much into it. And there are people who are far better qualified than me to opine on this particular aspect of it. But I actually found accepting uncertainty rather than constantly battling against it or fretting about it, like accepting it as a fact of life was a milestone moment for me that saw a very pronounced drop in my stress levels, anxiety, and blood pressure and all that kind of stuff. I actually
Yeah.
found it liberating because this insane kind of internal torment and pressure to make perfect decisions predicated on an erroneous belief that like business was an intellectual contest or conquest perhaps, all of that
Hmm.
just kind of went away if you see what I mean. Like
Yeah.
if you believe that the future is fundamentally knowable, right? Then and your strategies or your plans don't work
Hmm.
internally, that's an indictment of your ability,
Yeah.
right? If you believe that the world is inherently uncertain, there's an element of chance to everything, unpredictability is unavoidable, everything is a numbers game. Well, if it didn't work out this time, that's just the way that the cookie crumbled.
Hmm.
That's liberating to me. I think
Yeah.
if you apply for a job and you don't get it, most people I would say go through this process of hand wringing, of self doubt, of questioning their worth or value. But if you were to write on a whiteboard all of the factors in that process that were in your control, right? Like, okay, you could apply for jobs you're qualified for. You could get professional help polishing your resume and interview technique. You can show up on time. You can research the company. You can ask smart questions, whatever. And then you wrote down a list of all the things that aren't in your control, the other candidates, whether they think you're a good cultural fit, chemistry with the interviewer, their exact hiring criteria, whether they think you're under or overqualified, the political backdrop in the company, and went on and on and on, you'd realize that the number of, or the weight of factors out of your control massively outweigh the ones in your control. Why would you beat yourself up if you didn't get the job? Maybe your numbers just didn't come up. Maybe it just wasn't your time. Like, you just got to keep trying, or you've got to think probabilistically, assuming that that's going to be the case, right? Because that applies to everything. There's no investor who doesn't make bad investments. There's no entrepreneur who doesn't have ideas that don't work. There's no salesperson who has a 100% sales record. And as you get to the top of the game in anything, chance becomes more important. Like, if you watch a series like Drive to Survive, like this show about Formula One, these guys are all amazing drivers. Well, someone can just crash in front of you and it's not your fault and you're taken out. You can have a mechanical failure. It's not the driver. It just happened. Some freak occurrence can happen. Everything is probabilistic. And if you're going through life with this attitude that in fact it's deterministic and it's on you and it's knowable, then you create a lot of unnecessary pain and stress for yourself. And that's as important a part of the journey for me in my personal life, which is really why I wanted to write the book, as the kind of pragmatic, hands-on business stuff that the book is full of.
Yeah, I want to jump into that in a little bit more detail. I think it's so interesting because um, it kind of reminds me of the quote. I don't remember which football manager said it, or soccer if we're here in the US, but I think it actually goes all the way back to Gary Player, the golfer. But that phrase, "The more I practice, the luckier I get." And I think what's interesting about that is that there's, like, you can take it on the surface, which is actually a very, almost like, there could be a deterministic approach to that, as in, forget about luck, it's all about practice. But there's actually another view of that as well, which is just to say that if you're practicing a great deal, then you're increasing the number of chances you have of doing something right.
That's
And
absolutely
I
true.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that is everything that you say, everything that you talked about here is really centered around ultimately developing a set of individual skills, or if it's an organization, having the organization have the set of skills, as it were, to mean that in aggregate, with the millions of opportunities that they will have literally over the course of a day, if there are also a whole bunch of different decisions they're making, that on aggregate, those will lead to a good result. But none of it says that bad things can't happen, and bad things do happen, good things happen. And to your point, you need a bunch of things to go right for things to happen, in quotes, perfectly. You've just bought more tickets to the lottery, in a sense, if you do things well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not in any way denigrating the role of technique and skill and ability and preparation. And, I wrote 2 books on this
Yeah.
stuff, like on understanding the mechanics of your field and on understanding the basic principles of what you're doing and of being able to think in systems and of having a broad and deep knowledge base. I'm not saying, oh, it's just completely fucking random. So just, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm
Yeah.
just saying that we dramatically underestimate how probabilistic things are, how much uncertainty we're subject to in the environment. And we have an entire machine trying to convince us, well, 2 machines trying to convince us that that's not true, right? So, I mean, your
Yeah.
brain being one of them, but the other one, like,
Yeah.
if you have 2 consulting firms both pitching for work, and one of them shows up with a 100-slide deck with all these complex models and frameworks and graphs and ROI calculations and this kind of stuff. And the other one says, well, we're not going to promise you a return on investment because that's bullshit and these calculations are never true. So why don't we work on the basis of affordable loss, where you figure out how much you'd be prepared to spend that you'd feel comfortable losing if it doesn't work out. We'll go from there. I think we know who's going to win the work.
Yeah.
Right. But the irony is that if you look at how the world's foremost entrepreneurs and investors actually work, they
Work the other way.
work the other way, right? They
Yeah.
use affordable loss and they build real stuff, and they see if it works, and they see if people buy it, and they do it in as efficient, like as simplistic and low cost a manner as possible. And they know that show me beats tell me, and they don't fall for this stuff. They
Mm-hmm.
run experiments and they try stuff out. I mean, so it's a really interesting situation that we find ourselves in. And there's an entire chapter on this in the book. Chapter 2
Mm-hmm.
actually goes into the history. It sounds a bit dull when I say it out loud, but it's actually very fascinating. It goes into the history of management thought and how it all came about at this time when the world was rapidly industrializing, and the universities, particularly in America, were thinking, how are we going to cash in on this? How are we going to attract people to study? How are we going to have an academic study of business? Because the world is in industrializing. How are we going to do that? And at the time, the entire mindset of the nation was enthralled with science and technology, mechanical machines. So this mechanistic approach to the organization was what they based management education on,
Mm-hmm.
based on the ideas of this guy called Frederick Winslow Taylor, who kind of invented this concept called scientific management, which was a complete, I mean, it was, as you'll find in the book, like he just kind of made up the case studies. They didn't even really work, kind of ironically. And everything is just extrapolated from this same fundamental idiom from the kind of late 1800s. That A, never really worked in the first place, and B, certainly isn't fit for purpose now.
So fascinating stuff. Let's go into a specific area where I think your work will intersect really well with our work. And that's how individuals inside organizations and managers can navigate uncertainty more effectively. You've already touched on some of the really interesting aspects of this from a human perspective, right? You talked about the fact that our brains are not necessarily wired in that way. The things that we read are full of anecdotal information that persuades us that X has been successful. So if you just do your own thing in this way, then this will be successful, right? So, our brains are working against us. The information that we're presented with is working against us. Let's talk about how individuals can navigate this ostensibly. So I want to start with the background climate. Do you think that in our lives, and I'm talking about our jobs, the rest of our lives, do you think they are more uncertain and ambiguous than they used to be? Has there been a change over the course of the last, let's say, 100 years or 200 years that has made life more uncertain or ambiguous? Or are we just dealing with different kinds of uncertainty and ambiguity?
I would say that, so one of the kind of theories when it comes to dynamic systems is that we had this theory that was first discovered by the mathematician Poincaré, which was that when you have an error in a measurement, the more and you're like measuring one or two things, the more those things interact, or the more their path kind of changes, the more those errors are magnified, right?
Hmm.
And Lorentz discovered the same thing with the weather, which was that minuscule changes, like changing a reading from 5 decimal places to 3 decimal places, completely change the forecast. Because when you're dealing with dynamic systems where everything is interconnected, initial errors are magnified. It's called sensitivity to initial conditions, right? It's a systems phenomenon, which is why you kind of can't predict the weather beyond a certain point, right? I think when we look at the globalized economy, you're dealing with massively dense interconnections that mean that unpredictable or uncertain events are bound to happen and have big impacts. Um, and we're constantly having but I don't know if in our day-to-day lives we're actually experiencing more or less uncertainty. I just think we're not really aware of the uncertainty that we're experiencing, or we kind of go, that was weird, and then ignore it. Yeah, we don't. I think it's more the cognitive delusions rather than the uncertainty is on on the increase. So, like a lot of people, when I wrote the book, they're like, "Oh, this is perfect timing because we've had this massively uncertain time with COVID." And I'm like, "Well, what you'll learn from the book is that it's always a massively uncertain time,
Yeah.
and that everything's predictable until suddenly it isn't." Right, and we just aren't really tuned into it. We aren't attuned to it. So I would say maybe macro, like on a systems effect level, there's more potential for kind of black swan events, or there's more potential for like outlier events to occur, and there's probably more unpredictability when you're part of a massively dense interconnected dynamic system, probably. But on a personal level, I'm not one of these kind of hyperventilators who's saying we've never faced more uncertainty. I don't believe that to be true. I think we're in circumstances that are inherently uncertain, and we just don't acknowledge it. I think that's my realization.
Yeah, I think when I look at it in terms of the interviews we've done, so from our perspective, the way we look at this is like talking to lots and lots of people about how this feels, for want of a better term. And one of the things that we have definitely noticed is that regardless of what actually has happened at a macro level, because I'm very much with you on this, right? You only have to go back even, you know, 20, 30 years and find extraordinary events that we could never have predicted, and go back a little further than that, and things like the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? That felt like things would never be different until they dramatically and rapidly were, right? These things have always been within our history, but regardless of what's happening at a macro level, at an individual level for the individual, it does feel, if you ask a person, does this feel more uncertain and ambiguous now than it did looking back? Then those people generally report that yes, life does feel more uncertain and ambiguous. Now that could be about how we tend to look back at how we tend to reminisce, and how we tend to and for example, how we tend to sort of build in nostalgia into how we think about things. But at the same time, it does say something about the way people relate to uncertainty and ambiguity and all of these kind of interconnected elements. But in addition, which I think is really interesting, is that it seems to come, a piece of it appears to come from just, if you like, the optionality of existence these days. What I mean by that is that if you look back 30, 40, 50 years, the sheer number of things that you could be doing in the moment was way, way, way less than what you could be doing in the moment now, right? So I could pick up my phone and consume one of, a trillion applications. So I'm probably exaggerating, but I could spend my time. I could spend the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour in whatever way pretty much I wanted to. And all of this is available to me. And what I choose to do, how I choose to navigate that is is a series of tiny little decisions that I'm making. Whereas if you go back, before the Industrial Revolution, if you want to go back a long way, right? I'm waking up, I'm tending to the farm, I'm coming in at a certain time based on certain things like the weather will impact me, but exactly what I do and when I do it, that's kind of defined for me in terms of the lifestyle that I have. And so in that sense, this sort of like the number of different decisions that we could make in a moment, that seems to add to a feeling of uncertainty for a lot of people. Very micro, but it's part of the day-to-day existence of people.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to do a podcast interview where I'm trying to promote my book and promote another one, but there's a
That sounds
wonderful
great.
book written by a guy, Oliver Burkeman, called, I think it's 40,000 Hours Time Management for Mere Mortals.
Yeah,
And
I think
he,
it is. Yeah, it's very good.
yeah, and he makes this point that there's the, like, in our modern world, particularly with social media and everything, there's always this sense that there might be something better around the corner.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, I think he uses the example of talking about like dating apps where in theory it's easier to get a date because technology exposes you to poor choice of words there. Technology makes you available to potentially thousands of people in your local area who might be single, and it's all very efficient. But the problem is that in doing so, you then like you could find yourself in his example swiping through 1,000 people constantly, wondering whether the next person is going to be better or
Hmm.
more attractive. So like in the same way that um, email made communication more efficient than a fax machine, but then you just get a lot more emails than you ever did faxes at the
Yeah.
same time. They kind of offset it, right? So all of this stuff kind of breeds on itself. When I'm talking about uncertainty, though, I'm not really talking about that kind of choice paralysis. I'm talking
Yeah.
about the need to acknowledge that. In fact, it's a kind of uplifting message rather than a debilitating message about uncertainty, which is that every moment really is pregnant with opportunity, or can be. So like the most all of the most life-changing events in my life, some of which are kind of detailed in the book, had completely inauspicious beginnings, like trivial
Hmm.
interactions. My entire career got started, for example, because when I was 18 years old, I got on a train. I just finished school. I got on a train from my local station to Oxford, and I hadn't brought a book or anything with me. There's a free newspaper that's discarded on the seat opposite me. I picked it up and I started flicking through it, and I was looking for a job, and there was a job advertised in there, a sales job. It's IT recruitment or something that I'm spectacularly ill suited to. Anyway, I applied for the job and I got it, and I met my first career mentor who told me to stop kind of buffooning around and go to university. And then he gave me my first proper contract job out of university. And he also hooked me up with a digital agency while I was at university to get work experience. So I came out of university ready to be a UX UI design contractor and straight into my career, which was the starting point that led me to writing this first book on customer experience principles. If I hadn't picked up that newspaper, if I hadn't boarded that train, totally, totally trivial interactions, we wouldn't be talking now, and I wouldn't have
Yeah.
written these books. There's another great story in there about how the first book came about. I was visiting a friend of mine who was back from a tour of duty in Afghanistan. This is back in the UK. Went into the kitchen of his family home, and his younger brother was there. And he made me a cup of tea. And for some reason, we ended up arguing about some obscure psychological theory. He's pretty truculent, so am I. And I said, "Look, John, I know more about this than you because I'm researching it because I want to write a book on customer experience principles." And he was like, "Oh, that's amazing. I'm interning at one of London's top literary agents. Do you have a proposal?" I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "Well, you better fucking hurry up because I'm only there for another week." So I went straight home and I wrote like the crappiest business book proposal you've ever read in your life. Like 20,000 words of complete garbage, ill structured, probably riddled with typos, just a total mess. And
Is this
he
why?
printed
Is
it.
this why you got rejected by so many publishers initially?
Probably. But he printed it off and he gave it to this guy who I think literally sold the foreign rights to Harry Potter. Like,
Oh wow.
who read it, and he called me in and he was like, "There's some good ideas in here. You should work on A, B, and C." And he helped me shape it. And he actually, if it wasn't for him, I would not have got the publishing deal with FT for my first book. And then he himself represented the grid and mastering uncertainty. Like, if I hadn't blurted out my literary ambitions to my mate's kid brother over a cup of tea in their family home in Pangbourne, again, I would not have a career as a writer. I wouldn't have met all the amazing people. I wouldn't have read all the background reading. I would have met Matt Neal, who put us together. I wouldn't be on this podcast. I wouldn't have any books. I wouldn't be living in America. God knows what I would be doing. But the point is that this serendipity, this like being in the right place at the right time, a lot of it is just being open to the possibility that it might be happening. Like, this could go anywhere. And so the more interactions you have, the more people you meet, the more stuff you try. Like, back to your original point about the more I practice, the luckier I get. Like this serendipity stuff is like if everybody thinks about how they met the most important people in their life, their best friend, their business partner, their husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. If everybody thinks about how life-changing opportunities came along for them, whether it's how their career got started, whether how they ended up in their current job, whatever it is, and you think about the extraordinary confluence of factors that had to have come together to put you in that place at that time, you realize that it's serendipity, and
Yeah.
that's what we should be working on. Like we should be trying to expand our luck surface area, which is one of the key kind of concepts in the book that I heard from a developer called Jason Roberts. A brilliant turn of phrase, luck surface area. But all of this stuff that we think of as just being a sideshow, chance, serendipity, good fortune, probabilities, playing a numbers game, we think of as being kind of aberrations that are on the side of strategy and data and analysis and number crunching and clever matrices and everything. Whereas actually, it's not. It's the main event.
So there's a lot of clues in there about how to approach this from a mindset perspective. And it certainly sounds like in the writing of this book, it's had an impact on your own mindset about this, from the perspective of individual employees that sometimes just feel like a cog in a larger wheel. Um, what do you what is the most relevant thing that you think people can do from a mindset perspective as an individual employee that helps them become comfortable in living in this way and or become comfortable with this reality, if you like?
Well, that is a really difficult question to answer because when you're talking about an employee, are you really talking about somebody who's a leader, a manager, a decision maker, an executive, or just somebody who's
Yeah, let's start.
who?
We'll get on to those to leaders and managers and things. I think that's very important too. But I think also for any individuals that are listening to this, in some cases, like this uh, sounds very interesting,
Mhm.
but they're probably trying to relate this to practically how they go about approaching their life, where they don't necessarily feel very much in control of anything anyway.
Mhm.
What is it that they? How does it impact an individual that is just trying to do their job on a day to day basis?
Well, I think if you're just trying to do your job on a day-to-day basis and you're what you're really looking for is the permanence or the continuation of the status quo.
Yeah.
This book's probably not for you. because, because I think this book is about how your relationship with uncertainty fundamentally like has a profound impact on your ability to fulfill your potential, achieve your ambitions, cross shit off your bucket list that you really want to do but you won't start, and about confronting uncertainty head on. So if what you're trying to do is say I want to avoid uncertainty at all costs and just stay in my lane and stick in my groove and all of that stuff, that's cool. That's you know whatever makes you happy. Like people gotta be happy. That's awesome. But this is more like, okay, I want to do something different. I want to like I think most people have ambitions like
Yeah.
of some kind or bucket lists or things that they dream of doing, right? So one of the points I make in the book that I think is really how to like there's a whole section there on addressing fear of failure, which is something that I myself have spent years being like crippled by. And it's something that people who have read this in advance or people who I've talked about in advance, it's really struck a chord with them. Is this very simple concept that if you can't succeed if you don't try. Now
Mm,
that sounds obvious and trite and kind of like a shitty LinkedIn post, but in reality, a lot of people think, well, if I don't try, then I can't fail.
hmm.
But that's not really true. If you try, well, you have to try to succeed. If you try and you don't succeed, you probably learn something that's really valuable.
Yeah.
If you don't try, you can't succeed and you don't learn anything. So you've kind of failed by default, right? Now, a lot of people understand that intellectually, but if they don't, that can be a big moment for them realizing that. But the second thing to realize, which I think is like it's a phrase that Chaba uses all the time, you create
Chavish, your
momentum.
co-author, I should mention.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
You build momentum by building momentum. So what we have a habit of doing, let's say we have some big ambition, and it can be in your personal life or your work life. Like I've always wanted to surf a barrel at Pipeline or something, or I've always wanted to climb Mount Everest, or I've like whatever it might be, or I've always wanted to write a book. That's one I get asked about all the time for obvious reasons. What most people do is that they stare off to the finish line and they try and envisage all of the challenges that they might face, all of the obstacles they'll have to overcome, and all of the actions that they will need to undertake to take them from where they are, point A, to crossing the finish line, point B. They're like outcome driven. I want to
Mm-hmm.
accomplish the goal. Whereas all that's going to do is mean that you never get off the start line because either you're overwhelmed, you're exhausted before you've even started, or you're too intimidated by the task.
Yeah.
What you need to do is say, what's the one next thing I should do? Like Google karate lessons. Not if you want to
Mm-hmm.
climb Everest, but you know what I mean. Like,
Yeah.
what's the one next thing that I can do? And then you take that one step, and it's invariably something very easy. And then you take the second one, and then you take the third one, and like your boulder starts to roll, and
Mm-hmm.
then your momentum allows you to steamroll over the obstacles and things that you face, right? So, like one thing that I think applies to everybody, but particularly to people who struggle with a fear of failure or who have big ambitions but can't get off the start line, which is a lot of people. I use the term stiction in the books, like
Mm-hmm.
static friction, that initial inertia you've got to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Just what's the one next thing? It's going to be low cost, it's going to be low outlay, it's going to be low difficulty. Like, just do it. I mean, I built my first bike this way. I know you want to talk about bikes a little bit later,
Yeah.
but I never built a motorcycle. I had an IKEA toolkit. That's all I
Mm-hmm.
had. I was just like, what's the one next step? What's the next step after that? And it just happened. You know,
Yeah.
like people ask me, how do you write a book? And of course, there are technical things about writing a book, and there's really good advice that can solve you a lot of heartache. But ultimately, it's about, and this kind of dovetails with some of the things that are a bit more relevant to your line of work. Like, if you have a routine and you're making daily progress, then you're going to get there. You know.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I know you said that this book isn't for you if you fit into the category of somebody who want to get through a day. I think I would actually argue with the argue with the point, because I think you almost made it yourself, which is that many of the people that are just basically trying to get through the day, that are trying
Mhm.
to basically minimize the amount of uncertainty around them, as they can become more comfortable with the concept of uncertainty, then that gives them potentially the opportunity to see their world in a very different way, right?
This,
And to actually
yeah,
get themselves out of something that feels like they're stuck into something where potentially that
yeah.
they're not.
So there's one more point that I'd like to make about that is profoundly important and probably one of the most important things in the book, which is that most people try and identify what they want their upside to be and then do
Yeah.
what they can to try and lock it in, right? So I want to climb Everest, or I want to meet my life partner, or
Hmm.
whatever it might be. A far smarter way of approaching things is to say, what's my downside? And then limit your downside and then go from there. Like, in any given situation where you're worried about what the outcome might be, you're worried about uncertainty, you're worried about fear of failure, and you have a possible course of action, the question to ask yourself is not, is this guaranteed? It's, what's my downside? And if the downside is, somebody might say no, or I might look a bit silly, or any one of those largely trivial things,
Hmm.
if there's no major downside, then just get on with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was, I mean, all of these lessons. I don't put these ideas forth as some kind of great pedagogue or guru who was blessed with incredible foresight about these things. I I am sharing these things as somebody who has suffered with all of these things myself and has learned through painful first-hand experience and the help of an amazing set of mentors and advisors that this is just the way that it has to be. And I ended up writing the book I had no intention of writing a third book. I'd just become a dad. Like life was a bit of a mess and a challenge, but I thought this is so important that people know this stuff that it's got to be written,
Yeah.
and then I had to kind of get on with it. But yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
All right, so we talked a little bit about the individuals inside organizations, and as you mentioned, it's slightly different from managers and leaders and things like that. So let's briefly talk about that. One of the things that we've seen in working with individuals and in managers, there's a lot of connection, if you like, between this whole idea as to how you manage uncertainty and people's resilience. In other words, their ability, by definition, in a sense, resilience is our ability to be able to move forward in an uncertain, ambiguous world. I think I made up that definition, but it's approximately right. And so when you think about it from the perspective of a manager, it's a really interesting, or a leader inside an organization. All of this stuff becomes very interesting because you've got the manage the uncertainty of the business environment in which you sit, all of the external factors that can affect your business that you've already been talking about. And then, of course, particularly if people management is in your role, you've also got all of the uncertainty in the work lives and actually the broader lives. Now that many of us are working in hybrid worlds, and our work life and our non-work life are kind of merging together, you're dealing with all of that and potentially all of that in one go. And so I'm curious what you've seen in terms of how leaders and managers can approach this in a way that benefits them, but also benefits their teams and their organizations.
Yeah, I mean, there's an entire chapter on this in the book, so thank you for mentioning that. There's an entire chapter on implications of leadership, for leadership and management, if you're to try and embrace uncertainty in your business. And ultimately, you're talking about culture there as well, which is a topic that I've always desperately attempted to steer clear of, but I kind of couldn't avoid in this.
Yeah.
So a couple of big things. First is this concept of psychological safety. So, if people feel like they're going to be shamed for for things not going well, if people feel like if they have big ideas they're going to be laughed at, if people feel like taking risks sounds great on paper, but if those risks don't work out, you're punished for it, what's going to happen? You're just not going to do it. Right. So, the obvious starting point is to try and create, and this is detailed in the book, like more pragmatic advice on this, to try and create a psychologically safe environment where everybody feels like they can contribute and where they feel like they can actively question and challenge the way that things are done in the pursuit of a better outcome. Right. And that it's okay. It's kind of, when you're dealing with an uncertain world, failure might just happen. So, in fact, we did a project recently where, rather than the classic kind of business approach of what's the return on investment for this project, we did exactly that affordable loss approach, right? Which was, we said, we don't know whether this idea is going to work. We think it's cool. We're excited about it. Everyone's excited about it. But let's not count our chickens before they've hatched. How much are you prepared to spend on a rough prototype? So, we got a little bit of budget from our client and we built this prototype and we put it out to test in some stores. Pardon me. And it worked really well. But what was really interesting was that we learned a lot of things that didn't work well. And we also got a lot of potential to improve things. And it didn't quite work in the way that we anticipated. And we ended up going down in a slightly different trajectory, right? But what was interesting was, psychologically, as soon as you're saying we're doing this affordable loss approach, people are more curious, they're less stressed, they're more happy to report what they've learned, they're more happy to report things that invalidate initial hypotheses, and they're more happy to adapt the plan because you're starting from the point of view of our plan might be nonsense.
Mm.
and we feel safe in that. Whereas if you go into it with, well, we've commissioned a big agency and we've done a 400 slide deck on this and we've strategized and analyzed it to death, and here's what the ROI is going to be. If you don't then hit that, all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, now we might look a bit silly. Now we might have to cover it up. Now we're getting into news improvement and we're not really being entirely honest what's going on. And we're kind of not really communicating
Mm.
upwards the reality on the ground. Everybody's seen that all the time. Like, so this affordable loss approach to innovation is way more powerful and way less stressful, first of all. And second, like this psychological safety stuff is huge. Another bit that's huge is your error culture, right? So Gerd Gigerenzer is the guy who's always talking about this. You've got positive error cultures, like you've got in aviation, where if you make a mistake, you learn from it. And negative error cultures, where if you make a mistake, you try and make sure that nobody hears about it, and then you cover your ass as much as you can, right? Like you have
Mhm.
in healthcare. Like Ray Dalio in his book Principles makes like explains this annoyingly well, where he says, try to create an organization where it's perfectly acceptable to make mistakes and entirely unacceptable not to learn from them. I'm paraphrasing slightly there.
Mhm.
But, if you're dealing with uncertainty, which everybody is, mistakes are going to happen. We're all error prone. Outcomes are uncertain. Plans have got to change. Like as they say in the army, the first casualty of war is the plan.
Yeah.
But what we often see in big companies is, well, we've started the project, so we'll finish it. We've got the vision, so we'll see the vision through. Like there's this absolute resistance to changing your mind or admitting that things aren't correct, and it's a cultural factor. So the error culture, something that has to start from the top, is a big one, and that goes into incentives and everything else. And the third one, honestly, is diversity, cognitive and demographic diversity. Because the more diversity you have, the more mental models people have, the more lived experience people have, the more approaches people have, the more like the bigger the cognitive toolkit,
Yeah.
the bigger your toolkit is, the more problems you can solve and things that you can fix and ideas you can capitalize on. So, there is a real and proven benefit to cognitive and demographic diversity because the two go hand in hand. And so that's another thing. Like if all of your experts are very, very clever and they all approach the problem in exactly the same way, the problem is they all get stuck in the same place,
Yeah.
right? Like that's why Alan Kay said a change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. Because
Mhm.
if you can approach things in an entirely different way, then you might come up with solutions people had never considered or innovations that just weren't on anybody's roadmap. So, yeah, psychological safety, error culture, and diversity are three absolutely huge things that leaders and managers should be looking at.
Thank you, Matt. There's just one question I've got left for you.
Mhm.
So, as many of our listeners know by now, the research that we've done on remote and hybrid work environments is drawn from people who've been sustainably effective for years in what we refer to as unstructured, ambiguous environments. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but you were actually one of our interviewees. So, um, and part of the reason why we wanted to talk to you at that point was that, you built a good company, you'd written at that point two very successful books, and you'd also kind of like cultivated some important interests at the same time. And one of the things that struck me from that interview, and I went back and looked at the notes of it from just a few days ago, was at that time you spoke about almost these different aspects of your life as almost like part of that bigger picture of the whole, and how, for example, having an external interest like your motorcycle maintenance was actually helping you be more effective and more efficient at the at in quotes the work side of it. So
Mhm.
I wonder if you could explain a little bit about that. Explain how to our audience how these sort of different aspects of your life have worked together in order to help you be more effective at each of those individual aspects.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me start with the caveat that I do believe that everybody's brain has a particular kind of grain to it, right? So,
Hmm.
so what works for me? Like, I have a friend who does his best work from 11 p.m. till 4 a.m. And lives a lifestyle completely different to mine, but he's his output is prodigious, and he is capable of solving problems that I wouldn't even know where to begin. I mean, he's a kind of gifted engineering type. So, like the first thing I would say is you've got to find what works for you.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really important point, because we have to acknowledge that we're all different, and our optimum working life or work habits or schedule is going to be different, right? And
Hmm.
I say that because at times I have felt guilty that I don't work more than I do.
Mm.
But yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about this in the gym today. I had to do 2.5 minutes on one of these Nordic skiing machines. I was
Yeah.
like, wow, time is elastic. Like 2.5 minutes feels like an eternity on that thing. And if I'm stood
Yeah.
around the water cooler, it's gone in an instant. Like, it's not really the time, is it? It's what you put into the time that matters.
Yeah.
And I have been very, I've just kind of tried to, I've been in California way too long. I've just tried to know myself and what works for me, and what helps me. I find that my brain works best in the morning, and if I don't win in the morning, I ain't going to win at all. I also learned through writing that I can write 1,000 good words a day, and if those 1,000 words haven't happened by noon, they're not going to happen. So I should stop.
Hmm.
I think like one of the key things for anyone who's in a creative line of work, or a deep immersive kind of line of work, programming maybe, is you've got to establish your cadence. You've got to have a work rate that doesn't feel like a sequence of sprints, but that feels like an amble that you could
Hmm.
sustain forever. So like cadence is a huge thing. Timing is a huge thing, because I think we're good at different things at different times of day. I know at least I am. And also for me, it helps to mix up activities, right? Because I find that, like, and this is a common thing. This is not news. Like, a lot of people are like, I have a lot of good ideas when I'm raking the leaves or washing the dishes or I'm in the shower. Like, so I'm trying to mix activities that are deep. I'm trying to time box them so that they're occurring at the times I'm most effective. I'm trying to schedule my day so that I make time for everything that I need to do. And as you mentioned, I'm proactively planning into the day other things outside of work that make my life meaningful, so that I don't get to my deathbed and think shoulda, woulda, coulda, or binge on things. Like, I rather sustain them. So typically, I work like 7 till 1,
Hmm.
and that's focused work. That's not kind of bullshitting around and checking Facebook, which I don't have. That's like focused work. Then lunch and a walk or whatever. I do gym and everything before work. 2 to 4 typically is motorbikes or hobbies. 4 till 7, 7:30 is with my kid until bedtime, and then evening is just kind of unwinding and relaxing, or maybe going back to one of those other activities if I get a second wind. And what's funny is that when I say it like that, it doesn't sound like I spend a lot of time working, but you get far more done in a focused period of, like, whatever it is, 6 hours or
Yeah.
5 hours sometimes, than you do in a working day if you're constantly being interrupted by meetings and chit chat and Slack messages and everything else. Like, that's not me. When I'm at working, I'm working 100%. And you can write. If you think about it, if you can write 1,000 good words in a morning, there ain't nothing wrong with that. You've written an
Yeah.
80,000 word book in my maths isn't too good, but like 4 months.
Yeah.
I mean,
Or
obviously it
less.
takes you longer than that, but you know what I mean. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
daily progress is awesome, and sustainable work rates are awesome. And finding out what works for you is definitely awesome. And I would kind of encourage everyone to try and figure out what that looks like for them, and not feel bad if it's not what you thought it would be, or doesn't fit with societal pressures or conventions.
Thank you so much, Matt. I think that's a great way to end it. Really appreciate your time today. Very good luck with the book, and I know a lot of people are going to have a lot of or gain a lot of insights from reading it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Thanks, Paul.